The sun rose slowly over Tucson, painting the Catalina Mountains in soft shades of pink and gold. In the East Side neighborhood, where old adobe houses stood alongside new developments, life flowed at a steady, predictable pace. Everyone knew their neighbors, and local news spread faster than the internet. Bridget Carter woke up in her small apartment on Speedway Street with a smile on her face. It was only 3 days until her wedding, and every minute was filled with anticipation. At 20, she already knew she wanted to spend the rest of her life with Jake Miller, a guy who could fix any car and make her laugh even on the hardest days. The Sunset Diner on the corner of Grant Road and First Avenue was like a second home to Bridget. She had been working there as a waitress for 2 years, combining her job with a correspondence course at Pima College. The cafe's owner, 50-year-old Dorothy Sanchez, treated the girl like a daughter and was genuinely happy about the upcoming wedding. "My little bird is getting married," Dorothy would say to every customer, pointing to Bridget, who flitted between tables with a tray in her hands. "They're such a beautiful couple, just like in the movies." And indeed, Bridget and Jake looked like the embodiment of the American dream of young love. She was petite, with long brown hair and sincere green eyes, always ready to help and listen. He was a tall, broad-shouldered mechanic with kind blue eyes and calloused hands that could fix anything. Jake worked at Mike's Auto Repair on Stone Avenue. The owner, Mike Rodriguez, often joked that Jake understood cars better than people understood each other. The guy really did have a special talent. He could diagnose a problem by the sound of an engine and fix even the most complicated breakdowns. Customers trusted him with their cars, and his colleagues respected him for his honesty and hard work. The story of how they met was simple and romantic. A year and a half ago, Bridget's old Honda broke down right in front of the auto repair shop. Jake not only fixed the car for free, but also drove the girl home when it got dark. They had been inseparable ever since. Their wedding plans were modest but sincere. The ceremony was to take place at the Small Saint, Teresa's church on Campbell Avenue, where Reverend David Clark had agreed to marry the couple for free. The 50-year-old pastor had known Jake since childhood and had seen him transform from a troubled teenager into a responsible young man. "Love has changed this boy," Reverend Clark told his congregation. "Bridget has been his guiding star." Bridget bought her wedding dress at a thrift store on 4th Avenue. Simple but elegant, ivory in color, it fit her delicate figure perfectly. Dorothy from the cafe gave the girl her late daughter's veil, and her roommate, Maria, agreed to do her hair and makeup. Jake rented a tuxedo. Money was tight. A mechanic's salary didn't allow for many frills, but the young couple was happy with what they had. They planned a honeymoon at a motel near the Grand Canyon, 3 days and 2 nights, which Jake paid for out of his savings. However, there was one detail in the idyllic picture of their relationship that might have seemed strange to an attentive observer. Once a week, usually on Thursdays, Bridget would disappear for several hours. She told Jake she was going to the library or meeting with classmates, but her phone was unavailable during that time. Jake didn't suspect anything was wrong. He trusted his fiancée completely and was glad she was taking her studies seriously. After all, education was important for their future. Bridget was studying business administration and dreamed of starting her own business one day. Meanwhile, in another part of town, in a luxurious mansion in the foothills of Catalina, lived a man who knew much more about Bridget's Thursdays. Rupert Edwards, the 60-year-old owner of Edwards Meat Processing, the largest meat processing plant in the region, was one of the most influential people in Tucson. Edwards' factory employed more than 500 people and supplied its products throughout the Southwest. Rupert had built his empire from scratch, starting 30 years ago with a small butcher shop. Now his fortune was estimated at tens of millions of dollars, and the name Edwards was familiar to every resident of the city. Rupert had been widowed 5 years earlier when his wife Margaret died of cancer. They had no children, and after her death, he threw himself into his work with even greater zeal. Friends and business associates repeatedly tried to set him up with suitable women, but Rupert politely declined all offers. In society, he was considered an exemplary widower who remained faithful to his wife's memory. He donated large sums to charity, sponsored the local hospital and schools, and was a member of the city council. The Tucson Star newspaper regularly wrote about his philanthropic initiatives. Rupert looked respectable and distinguished. Tall, with gray hair and piercing gray eyes, he was always impeccably dressed. Expensive suits emphasized his status, and his confident gait and firm handshake spoke of a man accustomed to being a leader. Rupert's office was located on the top floor of the factory's administrative building. Large panoramic windows offered a view of the production halls and the mountains in the distance. The walls were decorated with diplomas, awards, and photographs with influential state politicians. On the massive oak desk were always neat stacks of documents and a portrait of his late wife in a silver frame. Rupert's secretary, 45-year-old Gloria Moreno, had been working with him for 12 years and knew his schedule by heart. She had noticed that in the last year, her boss had become more pensive and withdrawn. Sometimes he would stand at the window for a long time, staring into the distance, and he could suddenly become distracted during business meetings. "Mr. Edwards is going through a difficult time," Gloria explained to her colleagues. "The loss of his wife is still affecting him." But Gloria didn't know about her boss's Thursday absences. Once a week, Rupert would cancel all his afternoon appointments and leave the office on the pretext of personal business. His black Cadillac Escalade headed downtown to a small cafe on Grant Road. Everyone in town knew Rupert Edwards. His appearance at any establishment drew respectful attention. Waiters in restaurants vied for the best tables, and shopkeepers were especially helpful. His influence and wealth opened all doors for him. However, few knew that behind the mask of a successful businessman was a lonely man who had lost interest in life after the death of his wife. His huge house seemed like an empty mausoleum, and the work that had once brought him pleasure had become a routine. 3 days before Bridget and Jake's wedding, the atmosphere in their neighborhood was especially festive. Neighbors congratulated the young couple on the streets. Dorothy handed out free cupcakes to all the customers at the cafe, and Jake's colleagues at the auto repair shop joked that he would soon be an old married man. Reverend Clark conducted the final rehearsal of the ceremony in the nearly empty church. Bridget and Jake stood at the altar, holding hands, while the pastor explained the order of events. "When I ask if there are any objections to this union, don't worry," smiled the Reverend. "In 30 years of ministry, no one has ever objected. It's just a formality." The young couple laughed, imagining how anyone could object to their happiness. They seemed so young, so full of hopes and plans for the future. Bridget dreamed of children and a home of her own, while Jake planned to open an auto repair shop. A whole life full of possibilities lay ahead of them. But at that moment, as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of the church, none of them could have imagined that in 3 days their dreams would turn into a nightmare, and the idyll of their love would be destroyed forever. Thursday, halfway through the second day. Bridget finished her shift at the Sunset Diner earlier than usual. Dorothy let her go, knowing that the girl had a lot to do before the wedding. But instead of going home or to Jake's, Bridget headed for the small desert oasis motel on the outskirts of town. It was a modest Mexican-style motel with white walls and a red tile roof. It was mostly frequented by truckers and the occasional tourist who couldn't afford hotels in the city center. None of Bridget's acquaintances ever came to this area. Rupert Edwards was already waiting for her in room 127. Their relationship had begun a year ago under circumstances that Bridget still couldn't quite understand. At the time, she had been working in a cafe for only a few months and desperately needed money to pay for her education. Her scholarship wasn't enough, and her parents couldn't help her. Her father worked as a warehouse loader, and her mother cleaned offices at night. That day, an elegant middle-aged man in an expensive suit walked into the cafe. He ordered only coffee but left a $50 tip. When Bridget tried to return the money, explaining that it was probably a mistake, he smiled and said, "No mistake, dear. I just want to help a student." Rupert began to visit the cafe regularly. He always ordered the same table by the window and always left generous tips. Gradually, they began to talk. He was interested in her studies, her plans for the future, and her dreams. Bridget was flattered by the attention of such a successful and respected man. "You're too smart and talented to waste your life waiting tables," he said. "You have the potential for something more." When Bridget admitted that she might have to drop out of college due to financial problems, Rupert offered to help, not as charity, but as an investment in her future. He paid for her entire year of tuition and even gave her extra money for school supplies and living expenses. "Consider it a scholarship from a private fund," he explained. "The only condition is that you must study hard and achieve your goals." Bridget was moved to tears. She tried to refuse, but Rupert insisted. The only thing he asked in return was that they meet once a week to discuss her progress and plans, like a mentor and protege. For the first few months, that's exactly how it seemed. They met at different cafes around town. Rupert asked about her grades, gave her career advice, and talked about business principles. Bridget admired his intelligence, experience, and kindness. But gradually, something changed. Rupert began to ask more personal questions about her relationship with Jake, her plans for the future, and whether she was really ready to settle for the life of a mechanic's wife. The meetings became longer, and the conversations more intimate. "You deserve a man who can give you everything," he said, "who will open up a world of possibilities for you, not limit your life to a small town." Bridget felt that a connection was forming between them, one she couldn't quite define. Rupert was educated, sophisticated, successful, the complete opposite of the simple-minded Jake. When they talked, she felt grown up, important, special. The turning point came 6 months ago. After another meeting at the cafe, Rupert offered to walk her home because a sandstorm had broken out. In the car, an awkward silence fell between them, full of unspoken tension. "Bridget," he said quietly as he stopped at her house, "I can't hide it anymore. You've become more than just a ward to me." What happened next changed everything. Rupert kissed her, gently but passionately, and Bridget didn't resist. In that moment, she felt something she had never felt with Jake, a mixture of danger, forbidden desire, and adult passion. From then on, their meetings moved to a motel. Once a week, on Thursdays, they spent several hours together. Rupert rented a room under a false name, and Bridget told everyone she was going to the gym. Their relationship was complicated and contradictory. Rupert was a tender and passionate lover, but also demanding and possessive. He showered Bridget with gifts, expensive jewelry she couldn't wear, books, clothes. But most importantly, he made her feel important and special. "You're not like all those girls around you," he would say, lying next to her in a motel bed. "You have refinement, intelligence, ambition. You were made for a bigger world." Bridget was torn between two worlds. On the one hand, there was Jake's simple, honest love and their shared dreams of a modest but happy future. On the other, there was Rupert's dizzying world of opportunity, luxury, and adult passions. Jake suspected nothing. He was too honest and trusting to imagine that his fiancée could be leading a double life. When friends sometimes joked that Bridget was too good for him, Jake just laughed and said he was lucky. But Rupert became increasingly insistent. He wanted Bridget to leave Jake and commit her life to him. Not as a mistress, but as a life partner. He promised her a world that Jake could never offer her: travel, education at the best universities, her own business. "I can give you everything," he repeated. "All you have to do is admit that our relationship is more important than childhood dreams of a white dress and a mechanic boy." Bridget was torn. Rupert could really change her life, open doors she never even dreamed of. But she loved Jake, his kindness, his sincerity, his ability to find joy in simple things. With him, she felt like herself, not a project to be improved. The conflict reached its peak when Bridget announced her engagement. Rupert took the news as a betrayal. He became cold, then cruel. He accused her of ingratitude, of choosing mediocrity over greatness. "You're making a mistake that will ruin your life," he said after their last meeting before the engagement announcement. "And when you realize it, it will be too late." But Bridget had already made up her mind. She chose Jake. She chose simple, honest love. Her romance with Rupert was a dangerous folly that had to be abandoned. However, ending the relationship proved more difficult than she had thought. Rupert continued to show up at the cafe, call her, and demand to see her. He threatened to tell Jake everything, then swore his love and promised to wait until she came to her senses. The atmosphere in the motel room that Thursday was particularly tense. Rupert looked exhausted and aged. His usual confidence had left him, giving way to despair. "Tomorrow you're getting married," he said, without looking up, "to a man who will never understand who you really are." Bridget sat on the edge of the bed, not knowing what to say. She had come here to finally close this chapter of her life, but seeing Rupert suffer was agonizing. "You've given me so much," she said quietly. "An education, self-confidence, the understanding that I can achieve more. For that, I will be forever grateful. But I can't be with you." Rupert raised his head abruptly. There was pain in his eyes, but also something darker, an obsession, an unwillingness to let go. "You think it's that simple?" His voice trembled. "You can take everything I've given you and just walk away to someone else? I didn't just invest money in you, Bridget, I invested my soul." "I didn't deceive anyone," she protested. "I never promised to leave Jake. You knew about our relationship from the beginning." "But you gave me hope," Rupert exploded. "Every time you came here, every time you responded to my kisses, you gave me hope." Bridget stood up and headed for the door. This meeting had been a mistake. She should have just stopped coming, not tried to explain something she didn't fully understand herself. "If you leave now," Rupert said to her back, "if you marry that boy tomorrow, I'll tell him everything, every meeting we had, every kiss, every gift." Bridget froze at the door. "You wouldn't dare." "Test me," Rupert said with cold determination in his voice. "Do you think your simple-minded mechanic will forgive you for a year of lies? Do you think he'll understand why you kept quiet about who paid for your education?" She slowly turned around. Rupert was sitting on the bed, and for the first time since they had met, she saw not a successful businessman or a passionate lover, but a broken, desperate man who was willing to do anything to avoid being alone. "What do you want?" she asked. "You," he replied simply. "Only you. Call off the wedding, give us a chance." "And if I refuse?" "Then tomorrow, during the ceremony, when the priest asks if there are any objections, I'll stand up and tell everyone the truth." Bridget felt the world crumbling around her. She imagined Jake's face when he found out about her betrayal. She imagined the shock and pain in Reverend Clark's eyes, Dorothy's disappointment, the gossip throughout the neighborhood. "You can't do this," she whispered. "I can and I will," Rupert replied. "I have no choice, Bridget. I can't live without you. The months after Margaret's death were hell until you came along. You gave me a reason to go on living, and if I can't be with you, at least you won't be happy with someone else." Bridget ran out of the room without saying a word. She got into her car and sat there for a long time, gasping for air. Rupert could really carry out his threat. He had enough power and influence in the city to destroy not only her life, but Jake's as well. But canceling the wedding was also impossible. It would break Jake's heart just as much as the truth about her betrayal. Besides, despite all of Rupert's gifts and promises, she knew that their relationship had never been based on equality. He saw her as a project to be controlled, not as an equal partner. All the way home, Bridget tried to figure out a way out of the situation. Maybe she should tell Jake everything herself? But how could she explain a year of lies and silence? How could she explain that she had taken money and gifts from another man? When she got to her apartment, Jake was already waiting for her on the porch with a bouquet of wildflowers. "Hi, beautiful," he smiled. "I thought I'd meet my bride after a hard day." Looking into his sincere, loving eyes, Bridget felt a sharp desire to tell him everything. But instead, she hugged him tightly, trying to find protection from the impending disaster in his embrace. "We're getting married tomorrow," she whispered into his shoulder. "Tomorrow," Jake agreed, unaware that somewhere in the city, a lonely, desperate man had already made a decision that would change all their lives forever. Friday, the day before the wedding, Bridget woke up with a headache and a sense of impending disaster. She hadn't slept a wink all night, replaying Rupert's threats in her head and trying to find a way out of her hopeless situation. The Sunset Diner was bustling with festive activity. Dorothy had decorated the place with white ribbons and balloons, and on the menu board she had written in beautiful letters, "Congratulations to Bridget and Jake." Regular customers came in not only for coffee, but to congratulate the bride once again. "Honey, you look pale," Dorothy remarked as she poured Bridget a cup of strong coffee. "Are you nervous about the big day?" "It's normal, all brides are nervous." Bridget tried to smile, but it didn't look convincing. Every time the cafe door opened, she flinched, expecting to see Rupert's familiar figure. But he didn't show up, which for some reason scared her even more. The mood at Mike's auto repair was completely different. Jake was working with particular enthusiasm, humming under his breath and glancing at his watch from time to time. There were only a few hours left before the end of the workday, and in the evening, he had plans for a bachelor party, a modest gathering with his friends at a local bar. "Look at the groom," teased Carlos, the second mechanic. "You're glowing like a brand new coin. You'll wake up a different person tomorrow, amigo." "I'll be the same," laughed Jake, tightening a bolt on the engine. "Only happier." Mike Rodriguez, the owner of the service station, watched his best mechanic with warmth. Jake was like a son to him. He had hired the boy when he was barely out of high school and had seen him grow from a troubled teenager into a responsible young man. "After the honeymoon, let's talk about a raise," Mike said, approaching Jake. "A married man needs stability." In a mansion in the foothills of Catalina, Rupert Edwards sat in his study, staring into space. On the table in front of him lay a revolver, an old Smith & Wesson he had bought years ago for self-defense, but had never used. Next to it was a box of ammunition. He'd been up all night, tormented by pain and rage. The image of Bridget haunted him, her laughter, the scent of her hair, the tenderness of her touch. He couldn't bear the thought that all this would go to someone else, a simple mechanic who would never truly appreciate the treasure he was getting. Gloria knocked on the office door. "Mr. Edwards, haven't you forgotten about your meeting with the supermarket chain representatives? They've been waiting for half an hour." "Cancel all meetings," Rupert replied hoarsely, without looking up. "Tell them I'm sick." Gloria was surprised. In 12 years of working for him, she had only seen her boss sick twice, and even then he had insisted on going through with important negotiations. "Should I call a doctor?" she asked cautiously. "No, just leave me alone." After his secretary left, Rupert got up and walked over to the window. Below, workers were loading trucks with products from his factory. The empire he had built over 30 years ran like clockwork and brought in millions of dollars in profits. But what good was all that money if there was no one to share his success with? Margaret had died 5 years ago, and all this time he had merely existed, not lived. Work, charity, social events, it was all just a way to fill the void. Until Bridget came along. This girl awakened feelings in him that he thought were long dead. With her, he felt alive again, needed, capable of love. And now she wanted to take it all away from him to tie her life to a boy who had no idea what a treasure he was getting. Rupert took the revolver and checked the cylinder. 6 bullets. That would be enough. He had made up his mind and was ready to go through with it. At St. Teresa's Church, Reverend David Clark was preparing for tomorrow's ceremony. He was arranging flowers at the altar, simple white chrysanthemums donated by one of the parishioners. The church was small but cozy, with wooden pews and beautiful stained glass windows. The pastor had known Jake since he was a child. The boy grew up in a dysfunctional family. His father drank, and his mother worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. Jake often got into trouble, but deep down, he was a good kid. Meeting Bridget changed him for the better. "The Lord does not give us companions in life by accident," Reverend Clark mused as he rearranged the flower arrangement. "These two are made for each other." That evening, Jake's bachelor party was held at the Rodeo Bar on Stone Avenue. It was a modest affair, a few friends from the auto repair shop, a couple of buddies from school, pizza and beer. Jake didn't like loud parties, preferring to spend time with close friends. "To the groom!" Carlos raised his glass. "May your married life be as reliable as the engines you repair." Everyone laughed and congratulated Jake, but he kept glancing at his watch, thinking about Bridget. She was having a bachelorette party at home with her friends, a quiet evening with movies and ice cream. He wanted to be with her, especially seeing how nervous she had been in recent days. And Bridget's friends had indeed gathered in the small apartment on Speedway Street. Maria, her neighbor, brought homemade face masks. Sarah from college brought romantic comedies on DVD. Lisa, a colleague from the cafe, brought homemade cookies. But Bridget hardly participated in the general merriment. She smiled and answered questions, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Every few minutes she checked her phone, waiting for a call or text from Rupert. "Bridget, you're all on edge," Maria remarked. "Relax. Tomorrow will be a wonderful day." "I'm just nervous," Bridget replied, trying to focus on the movie. "It's normal," Sarah reassured her. "A wedding is a big deal, but you're marrying a wonderful guy. Jake adores you." Bridget nodded, but inside she felt sick. Jake did adore her, and that was why the truth about her affair with Rupert would break his heart. But what was worse, she wasn't sure she could tell him everything herself. And that meant that tomorrow, during the ceremony, Rupert would carry out his threat. When her friends left, Bridget sat alone for a long time, thinking about the situation. She had several options: tell Jake everything right now, run away from town before the wedding, or try to convince Rupert to change his mind. The first option seemed the most honest, but also the most painful. How could she explain a year of lies and betrayal? The second option was cowardly and destructive for everyone. The third option offered at least a glimmer of hope. Around midnight, Bridget dialed Rupert's number. He answered after the first ring, as if he had been waiting for her call. "I knew you'd call," he said. "I need to talk to you," she said quietly. "Can we meet?" "Sure. Same place?" "Number too far. Let's meet at Reed Park by the pond. In half an hour." Reed Park was a small green area in the center of town. At night, it was deserted, lit only by a few streetlights. Bridget arrived first and sat down on a bench by the artificial pond where ducks swam and children played during the day. Rupert showed up 10 minutes later. Even in the dark, she could see that he looked terrible, unshaven, with red eyes and rumpled clothes. This was not the elegant, confident man she knew. "Are you here to tell me you're calling off the wedding?" he asked, sitting down next to her. "I came to ask you not to," Bridget replied. "Don't ruin innocent people's lives tomorrow." "Innocent?" Rupert sneered bitterly. "You consider yourself innocent? After a year of lies, after taking my money and gifts, making love to me, and planning a wedding with someone else?" "I never promised to leave Jake," Bridget repeated. "You knew about our relationship from the beginning." "But you gave me hope," Rupert exploded. "Every kiss, every 'I miss you,' every time you said I was special. It all gave me hope." Bridget was silent. He was right. She had sent mixed signals, enjoying the attention and care but not wanting to give up her old life. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Be with me," Rupert replied simply. "Not as a mistress for an hour a week, but as a life partner. I'm offering you the world, Bridget. Travel, education, opportunities you never even dreamed of." "What if I don't want that world?" she asked quietly. "What if I want a simple life with the man I love?" "Then you're deceiving yourself," Rupert said harshly. "You're too smart and ambitious to live the life of a mechanic's wife in the suburbs. Sooner or later, you'll regret your choice." "It's my choice," Bridget said firmly, getting up from the bench. "And you have no right to destroy it." "I do," Rupert replied, also getting up. "Because I love you more than life itself. And if I can't be with you, then no one can." There was such cold determination in his voice that Bridget felt afraid. This wasn't just a desperate lover. This was a man who was ready for anything. "What do you mean?" she asked. "You'll see tomorrow," Rupert replied and walked to his car. Bridget stood alone in the empty park, realizing she had made a mistake. Instead of calming Rupert down, she had made him even angrier. And now she didn't know what he was capable of in his desperation. She spent the rest of the night awake, standing at the window and looking at the city lights. Tomorrow was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Instead, she felt like she was heading toward a disaster she couldn't prevent. Somewhere in the city, Jake slept peacefully in his apartment, dreaming of tomorrow. And in the mansion on the hill, Rupert Edwards sat with a revolver in his hands, preparing for what was to be his last and most desperate act. Saturday, May 15th. The wedding day began with a golden sunrise over the Catalina Mountains. The sky was cloudless, the temperature perfect for a May day in Arizona. It seemed as if nature itself was blessing the union of Bridget and Jake. The apartment on Speedway Street was filled with joyful bustle. Maria arrived at 7 in the morning with coffee and croissants, and at 8 the rest of the bridesmaids showed up. Despite a sleepless night, Bridget tried to look happy, but the dark circles under her eyes betrayed her state. "My God, you haven't slept," Sarah noticed immediately, taking out her makeup bag. "It's okay, concealer works wonders." Maria began to do her hair, a simple but elegant bun with a few strands left loose. The white veil, inherited from Dorothy's late daughter, was decorated with small pearls and looked vintage and romantic. The ivory wedding dress fit Bridget's delicate figure perfectly. The simple cut emphasized her natural beauty, and the long lace sleeves added a touch of elegance. When the girl looked at herself in the mirror, her friends gasped. "Jake is going to faint when he sees you," Lisa said admiringly. But Bridget could hardly hear the compliments. She was thinking about Rupert, about the cold tone with which he had spoken his last words. "You'll see tomorrow." What did he mean? The phone was silent. No calls, no messages. The silence was more frightening than any threat. At that moment, Jake was waking up in his small apartment on the other side of town. He took a shower, shaved carefully, and put on the tuxedo he had rented. The black jacket was a little too big for him, but it looked quite presentable. Mike Rodriguez arrived to pick him up at 9 in the morning. The owner of the auto repair shop had agreed to be his best man. Jake considered him a second father. "Ready for the big day?" Mike asked, helping the young man adjust his bow tie. "Ready," Jake smiled, though his hands were shaking slightly with excitement. "I can't believe Bridget agreed to marry me." "Believe it, amigo. You deserve happiness." At St. Teresa's Church, Reverend Clark was making final preparations. He arranged the flowers, checked the microphone, and laid out the ceremony programs on the wooden pews. The small church could hold about 100 people, but no more than 50 guests were expected. Relatives, friends, and colleagues. The altar was decorated with simple white chrysanthemums and greenery. The stained glass windows let in the soft morning light, creating an atmosphere of peace and solemnity in the church. Everything was ready for the joyous event. The pastor knew that this would be a special ceremony. He had seen many couples in his 30 years of ministry, but the sincerity of Jake and Bridget's love touched his heart in a special way. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the first guests began to arrive at the church. Bridget's parents, Thomas and Linda Carter, looked excited and proud. Her father worked as a warehouse loader, and her mother cleaned offices, but they had saved all their money so that their daughter could get a decent education. "Our little girl is getting married," Linda whispered to her husband, wiping away tears. "Remember when she was little and played bride?" Jake's parents had come from a neighboring town. His father, Frank Miller, was a construction worker, and his mother, Jenny, worked in a grocery store. They were happy that their son had finally settled down. Dorothy from the cafe came in her best dress and with a huge bouquet of flowers. She cried with emotion as she looked at the altar where her beloved waitress would be standing in an hour. Jake's colleagues from the auto repair shop took up several rows in the back. Carlos brought a camera to capture the important moments. They were all sincerely happy for their friend. At 10:30, Bridget arrived with her friends. She sat in Maria's car, trying to calm her trembling hands. The sight of the church decorated with ribbons and flowers should have been joyful, but instead it caused a panic attack. "Everything will be fine," Maria said reassuringly, noticing her friend's state. "In an hour, you'll be Mrs. Miller." Bridget nodded, but deep down she prayed that Rupert wouldn't show up. Maybe their conversation yesterday had brought him to his senses. Maybe he realized that threats wouldn't win her love back. About 40 people had gathered in the church. The atmosphere was warm and joyful. People talked quietly, children ran between the rows, and some took photographs. At exactly 11 o'clock, wedding music began to play. Jake, accompanied by Mike, walked to the altar. The young man looked nervous but happy. He adjusted his tie and stood still, waiting. The bridesmaids, dressed in simple blue dresses, were the first to walk down the aisle. Then Bridget herself appeared, arm in arm with her father. The church fell silent. Even the children stopped making noise, enchanted by the beauty of the bride. Bridget walked slowly down the aisle, each step difficult. She searched the rows for familiar faces, afraid to see someone she didn't want to see. Jake looked at the bride with adoration. Tears welled up in his eyes. He had never seen Bridget so beautiful. At that moment, he was the happiest man in the world. Thomas Carter gave his daughter away to the groom and took his place next to his wife in the front row. Bridget and Jake stood before the altar, holding hands. Reverend Clark began the ceremony with the traditional words. "Lovers, we are gathered here in the presence of God and these witnesses to unite Jacob Miller and Bridget Carter in holy matrimony." The pastor's voice was solemn and warm. He spoke of love, fidelity, and mutual support. The guests listened with emotion, and some of the women cried softly at the touching moment. "Marriage should not be entered into lightly, but thoughtfully and reverently," continued Reverend Clark. "If anyone here knows of any reason why these two should not be lawfully joined in marriage, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." These words were spoken at every wedding ceremony, but they were usually just a formality. The pastor paused briefly, as was customary, preparing to move on to the exchange of vows. At that moment, the heavy doors of the church creaked open. All heads turned. Standing in the doorway was Rupert Edwards in a dark suit. He looked exhausted but determined. His right hand was lowered at his side, but a careful observer could see a metallic glint in his fingers. "I have an objection," Rupert said clearly, taking a step into the church. A whisper ran through the rows. People looked at each other, not understanding what was happening. Some recognized the influential businessman, but no one could explain his appearance. Bridget paled and instinctively took a step back. Jake looked at the stranger in confusion but tightened his grip on his bride's hand. "Sir," Reverend Clark said politely but firmly, "this is a private ceremony. If you have business in the church, please wait outside." "My business concerns the bride," Rupert interrupted, walking slowly down the aisle. "This woman cannot marry because she already belongs to me." Shock rippled through the church. People began to talk louder. Some stood up from their seats. Bridget's parents looked at their daughter in bewilderment. "What does he mean?" Jake asked, turning to Bridget. The girl couldn't say a word. Her worst fears were coming true in front of all her loved ones. "Tell him, Bridget," Rupert demanded, stopping a few steps from the altar. "Tell your fiancé about our meetings, about who paid for your education, about what happened between us every Thursday for a year." The church fell silent. All eyes were fixed on the bride, who stood like a statue, unable to move. "That's not true," Jake said hoarsely, though his voice already betrayed his doubts. "Bridget, tell him it's not true." Tears streamed down the girl's cheeks. She looked into the eyes of the man she loved and saw growing pain and disbelief. "I can explain," she whispered. Those words were her sentence. Jake let go of her hand and took a step back, as if he had been physically struck. "So it's true?" he asked, his voice breaking. Rupert smiled triumphantly. "She's mine, boy. She always was. You just didn't know what you were dealing with." "Stop this," Reverend Clark intervened. "Sir, I ask you to leave the church immediately, or I will have to call the police." "No," said Rupert, raising his right hand. The revolver flashed in the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. Screams of horror rang out through the church. People jumped up from their seats, some falling to the floor, covering their children. "Rupert, no!" Bridget screamed. But it was too late. Two shots rang out almost simultaneously. The first bullet hit Bridget in the chest, the second in the stomach. Her white dress was instantly stained red. The girl fell at the foot of the altar like a broken doll. Jake rushed to her, fell to his knees, trying to stop the bleeding with his hands. "Bridget, Bridget, hold on!" he cried through his tears. Chaos reigned in the church. People screamed, cried, and crowded around the exits. Children cried in fear. Women fainted. Someone called the emergency services. Rupert stood in the middle of the aisle with a smoking gun in his hand. His face showed a strange mixture of satisfaction and horror at his own actions. "If I can't have you, no one can," he said quietly, looking at the dying Bridget. Mike Rodriguez and two men from the guests cautiously approached the shooter. Rupert did not resist. He seemed to have fallen into a trance after what he had done. "Take the gun away from him!" someone in the crowd shouted. Mike carefully took the revolver from Rupert's limp hand. The businessman allowed himself to be disarmed without a word of protest. Bridget lay in a pool of blood, her breathing becoming more and more shallow. Jake held her head on his knees, whispering words of love and comfort. "I love you," she whispered barely audibly. "Forgive me. Forgive me." "Don't say that," Jake cried. "Everything will be okay. The ambulance is on its way." But they both knew that help would come too late. Life was leaving Bridget with every passing second. Reverend Clark, forgetting his own safety, approached the dying girl. He knelt down next to Jake and took Bridget's hand in his. "God be with you, child," he said softly. "You are forgiven." Bridget tried to smile, but she didn't have the strength. Her eyes slowly faded. Police and ambulance sirens could already be heard in the distance, but it was too late. At 11:23 a.m. on her wedding day, Bridget Carter died in the arms of the man she loved. Rupert stood motionless, staring at the result of his actions. The police burst into the church a few minutes later and immediately handcuffed him. "Rupert Edwards, you are under arrest on suspicion of murder," announced Detective Sarah Thompson, who was one of the first to arrive. Rupert did not resist. He seemed not to hear the words about his rights, nor did he see the chaos around him. His gaze was fixed on Bridget's body, which the medics were already covering with a white sheet. What should have been a day of joy and new beginnings had turned into a tragedy that shook the entire neighborhood. The wedding ceremony ended in murder, and dreams of a happy future were shattered forever. Detective Sarah Thompson had been with the Tucson Police Department for 22 years, but she had never encountered a case like this before. A murder at a wedding, in front of 40 witnesses, committed by a respected businessman. It was beyond her experience. 3 hours after the tragedy, she sat in the interrogation room across from Rupert Edwards. The man looked broken, aged 10 years. His expensive suit was stained with blood, his gray hair was disheveled, and his eyes were empty. "Mr. Edwards," the detective began, turning on the tape recorder, "do you understand what you are accused of?" Rupert nodded slowly. "I killed Bridget. Tell us what happened between you." And Rupert told her. Without emotion, as if reading from a script, he recounted the entire story, from their first meeting in the cafe to the final shot. The detective listened, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "Why did you decide to kill Miss Carter?" Sarah asked. "I didn't plan it," Rupert replied. "I mean, not like that. I was only thinking about stopping the wedding. But when I saw her in that dress, standing next to him when I realized I'd lost her forever." He fell silent for a long minute. "Something broke inside me. If she wasn't mine, she wasn't anyone's. Wasn't." Meanwhile, witnesses were being questioned. Jake was sitting in a hospital room. The shock had caused his blood pressure to rise, and the doctors insisted he be kept under observation. Detective Thompson came to see him that evening. The young man looked devastated. In one day, he had lost his fiancée and learned of her betrayal. The pain in his eyes was so intense that even an experienced investigator felt compassion. "Jake, I need to ask you a few questions," she said gently. "I didn't know anything," he replied hoarsely. "I swear, I had no idea there was anything between them." The detective believed him. Statements from all of Jake's acquaintances confirmed that he was sincerely in love and trusted Bridget completely. "She said she went to the library on Thursdays," Jake continued. "I was proud of her hard work, and she was with him." Tears streamed down his cheeks. Sarah gave him time to calm down. In the days that followed, the picture of what had happened became clearer. The detective questioned the employees of the Desert Oasis Motel, who confirmed that Rupert and Bridget had been meeting regularly. The manager showed her the records in the guest book. Room 127 had been rented every Thursday for 8 months. Gloria Moreno, Rupert's secretary, told her about her boss's strange behavior in recent weeks. Canceled meetings, long, pensive pauses by the window, nervousness. "He changed a lot after his wife died," she told the detective. "He became withdrawn and lonely, and in the last year he seemed to come back to life, but then he went back to being depressed." Bank records showed that Rupert had indeed paid for Bridget's education and regularly transferred money to her. Expensive gifts, jewelry, even a car, It was all recorded in the financial documents. Dorothy from the Sunset Diner cried during the interrogation. "My girl, she was good but naive. That man took advantage of her youth, her need for money." Bridget's parents, Thomas and Linda Carter, were in shock. They had no idea about their daughter's relationship with the influential businessman. "She said she had received a scholarship from some foundation," her mother sobbed. "We were so happy that our daughter could study. How could we have known?" A week after the murder, Bridget's funeral took place. The small cemetery on the outskirts of town was filled with people. Everyone came, colleagues from the cafe, classmates, neighbors. Even those who had condemned the girl for her relationship with a married man came to pay their last respects. Jake stood by the coffin in the same tuxedo he had worn at the wedding. He didn't cry. The tears had run dry a few days ago. Now there was only emptiness inside him. Reverend Clark conducted the service. He spoke of forgiveness, of the complexity of human relationships, of how no one has the right to judge another. Bridget was young. She made a mistake, but she didn't deserve to die like that, he told the congregation. May her soul rest in peace. Rupert was in prison awaiting trial. His lawyer, the experienced Robert Stein, advised him to plead guilty to second-degree murder, citing emotional distress. This could reduce his sentence from life to 20 to 30 years, but Rupert refused. "I knew what I was doing," he told his lawyer. "I chose this. I want to stand trial and tell the whole truth." The preliminary hearings began a month later. The courtroom was packed. The case had attracted the attention of the entire city. Journalists, onlookers, relatives of the victim and the accused. Prosecutor Michael Davis presented the court with a clear picture of premeditated murder. The defendant stalked the victim, threatened her, and when she refused to comply with his demands, he cold-bloodedly killed her. The defense attorney tried to present the case as a crime of passion. "My client is a respected member of the community who lost his mind due to grief and despair." But Rupert's own testimony destroyed this strategy. He spoke in detail about his relationship with Bridget, without hiding any details. He admitted to threats, attempts at coercion, and plans to disrupt the wedding. "Do you regret what you did?" asked the prosecutor. Rupert was silent for a long time. "I regret that it came to this, but I couldn't let her go to another man. She was my only hope for happiness." Jake was present at all the hearings. He listened to the details of his fiancée's affair with the murderer and felt a new wave of pain each time. But he wanted to know the truth, the whole truth. In his testimony, he talked about the plans he had made for the future with Bridget, about the house they wanted to buy, about the children they dreamed of having. "She lied to me for a year," he told the court, "but I still loved her, and this man, had no right to take her life." The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. Judge Margaret Holmes handed down the sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. "Mr. Edwards," she said, addressing the convicted man, "you abused your position, manipulated a young woman, and when you couldn't control her, you killed her. Society must be protected from people who consider others to be their property." Rupert accepted the sentence without emotion. He was led away in handcuffs under guard, and the residents of Tucson never saw him again. The Edwards meat processing plant was sold to competitors. The mansion in the foothills stood empty for several months until a buyer from another state was found. No one in town wanted to live in the house of a murderer. Jake continued to work at the auto repair shop, but he lacked his former energy. Mike Rodriguez was concerned about the young man. He had become withdrawn, gloomy, and avoided social interaction. "You need help, son," Mike would say. "Maybe you should see a professional?" But Jake refused. He blamed himself for not noticing his fiancée's infidelity, for not being able to protect her. Every Thursday, he remembered where Bridget had been at that time, and the pain became unbearable. 6 months after the tragedy, the Sunset Diner closed. Dorothy couldn't bear to see the empty space behind the counter where Bridget used to work. She sold the business and moved to California to live with her daughter. St. Teresa's Church had not held a wedding ceremony for a long time. Reverend Clark couldn't look at the altar without remembering that terrible day. The blood stains on the stone floor had been washed away, but the memory of the tragedy remained forever. Sometimes evil wins, he said in his sermons, but we must not lose faith in humanity, in love, in forgiveness. Detective Sarah Thompson received a promotion for solving the high-profile case, but she often wondered if the tragedy could have been prevented. If Bridget had gone to the police about the threats, if someone had noticed signs of Rupert's dangerous obsession. In our line of work, there's always the what-if question, she told her younger colleagues, but we can only investigate what has already happened. A year passed. On the anniversary of the murder, Jake visited Bridget's grave, a simple gray stone with her name and dates of birth and death. 20 years, such a short time on this earth. He laid white chrysanthemums, the same flowers that had adorned the altar on the day of their canceled wedding. "I forgive you," he said quietly, "and I still love you, but I have to move on." It was the first time in a year that he had been able to say those words without tears. In an Arizona state prison, Rupert Edwards sat in a solitary cell. He had grown old and gray, but there was no remorse in his eyes, only emptiness. He received letters from journalists, psychologists, and writers who wanted to study his case, but he never replied to anyone. His story had been told in court, and he had nothing more to add. Sometimes at night he remembered his Thursday meetings with Bridget, her laughter, the scent of her hair, the tenderness of her touch. These were the only bright moments in his new life. The tragedy at the wedding changed many lives. Some people found the strength to move on, others remained broken forever. But the main lesson was that love cannot be forced, and another person is never your property. The story of Bridget, Jake, and Rupert serves as a warning about what obsession disguised as love can lead to. The East Side will long remember that day when joy turned to tragedy and dreams of happiness became a living nightmare.